Shock.
Doctor, this patient's lost a lot of blood. It looks like she's going into shock.
We hear the word all the time. You get shocked when you touch a live wire. We talk about it when somebody's had a terrible experience or received bad news. Shame, she's just in shock. Or when a person is offended by something. That is shocking. But what is shock in a medical context? Life in the Fast Lane, which is one of my favorite resources, defines it as follows. Shock is a state of circulatory failure characterized by globally impaired tissue perfusion that is insufficient for the needs of the body. Let's translate that, shall we? Shock is a crisis situation where blood in the body, and specifically oxygen in the blood, is not reaching the organs where it's needed. And of course, we're talking about the brain, the heart, the lungs, the liver, all those essential organs that we need in order to be able to function and survive. There are 4 types of shock, and I'm going to break it down for you really simply. I like to look at it like this. The lungs mine oxygen from the air, and they pump out carbon dioxide in exchange, as we know. But what does that remind you of? A factory. Lungs are oxygen factories. But just like a factory that produces, say, soap, that's not the end of the story. Soap that's produced in a factory has to go through a number of processes before it arrives in our homes, available for us to wash our hands. A logistics center has to collect the soap, organize it, decide where it's going, and dispatch it to its destination. A transport system has to distribute the soap using trucks or trains or ships, following a route to get where it needs to be. The body is exactly the same. The heart is a logistics center, accumulating the latest batch of oxygen produced by the lungs, and then pumping it in various directions, controlling at all times how much, how fast, and where it is going. Oxygen molecules have to be loaded onto ships, and we call these hemoglobin molecules. The ships, of course, need water to float on, and that's our blood. And the blood, in turn, is carried in canals or waterways that we know to be blood vessels. Note that I am simplifying the relationship between hemoglobin and blood here. In truth, hemoglobin is bound to a red blood cell molecule, which then is carried within the bloodstream. But for the purposes of our illustration, hemoglobin ships will do. But let's say something goes wrong with this careful balance of supply and demand. Let's say the heart fails. Now, there may be a number of reasons for this. Stab wound to the heart. Most people think that any stab wound to the heart is going to cause you to drop down dead immediately. In fact, that's not always the case. Another example is a tired, flabby old heart muscle that can't pump as effectively as it used to. It just kind of half-heartedly pumps away. Or perhaps a heart that's had an area of its muscle damaged by a heart attack. The bottom line is the heart isn't pumping as it should, and the whole logistical process of collect, organize, and distribute slows right down. Blood comes into the heart, but it isn't getting out properly. In fact, the pressure drops so low that the ships are not even getting out of the harbor, or only a few of them are getting out of the harbor, and supply is no longer meeting demand. What do we call this? Well, remember that in Latin, the heart is cardia. And if the heart is the beginning of the problem, the genesis of the problem, think the first book of the Bible, then the shock that we're dealing with caused by the heart is cardiogenic shock. Let's say the blood is somehow compromised. The ships are being lost at sea. Pirates are taking them, and there are less and less of them available to carry oxygen to where it's needed. What's a good example of this? Well, bleeding, probably the best one. You're bleeding out, blood is falling on the floor, hemoglobin is falling on the floor, and now there's less and less transport mechanism to take the oxygen to my organs. What do we call this? Well, remember that hypo means low. They both have O's in them. And of course, we're talking about volume. So we've got a suddenly low volume of blood in our bodies. We're going into hypovolemic shock. Third scenario, the heart is working, there's enough blood in cargo ships, But for some reason, the canals that the ships are traveling in have widened. And think about it. If any tube or container becomes bigger and the volume of the fluid inside it stays the same, what happens to the water level? It's going to drop. The pressure's going to drop. And very soon, those ships are going to be scraping the bottom because their water level is so low. The heart is still trying to send them out, and it's doing it stronger and harder and faster, but despite its best efforts, those ships are starting to run aground, and behind them there's a backup, just like what happened with the Ever Given ship in the Suez Canal. But I can hear the question marks popping up in your mind. You're thinking, that doesn't make sense. Why would the body want to do that? Surely that's a bad thing. Well, let's look at a couple of examples. When you get a pimple, the skin around the pimple becomes very pink if you have pale skin, or very dark if you have darker skin. Why is that? It's because the blood vessels have increased their diameter, calling more blood into the area. So there's more blood surrounding your little pimple in order to try and clean out all the gunk that's there and heal up the pimple. So dilation of blood vessels is a very good thing for the body. It also does this in the presence of allergies. Anyone who has had an allergic reaction to something will know that they get areas of redness. But some infections aren't just localized to one spot. Some infections go rampant throughout our body, and of course we call that sepsis. And unfortunately, when that happens, the body tries to use the same principles in fighting a local infection in order to try and fight the widespread infection. And it does exactly the same thing. It vasodilates all of its blood vessels, trying to get more blood everywhere. But the problem is there isn't more blood. So if you've got a little allergy or a little pimple or a little abscess, it can recruit blood from other areas of the body where it's perhaps not needed as much right now. But if it does that everywhere, we start running into trouble because there isn't enough blood to compensate for this suddenly enormous container, and the blood level is going to drop. And we call that septic shock. Similarly, in a widespread allergy, and we call that anaphylaxis, where, for instance, you've been stung by a bee or you've been exposed to a penicillin antibiotic and your body's just gone haywire and it's just reacting with an allergic reaction all over the place. Exactly the same thing happened. Widespread blood vessel dilation and a sudden drop in blood pressure. There's a third example though, and it's part of the same group and very important to understand. The blood vessels, of course, are controlled by the nervous system. So every blood vessel is essentially a muscle, and the little muscles, just like our normal muscles, are controlled by tiny, tiny little nerves that, of course, feed back to our brains via our spinal cord. And if somebody is in let's say, a major car accident or falls out of a tree and breaks their back, the communication between brain and blood vessels is suddenly interrupted by, say, a severed spinal cord. All of a sudden, there's no longer nerves to tell the blood vessels to squeeze. And so they're just going to relax, just the way any muscle would suddenly relax if it's not given instructions to squeeze. And all over the place, those blood vessels relax and dilate, increasing the size of our container, dropping our blood pressure and our blood level. Now, what do we call this? It's quite an easy one because it has to do with the distribution of blood in the blood vessels. So we call it distributive shock. The blood has redistributed into a low pressure situation, a shock situation. And like I mentioned before, there's really only three causes of this, and that is sepsis, and so of course the subgroup is septic shock. Anaphylaxis, our widespread allergy, so we talk about anaphylactic shock. And of course, the neurological type of shock, we call it neuro, meaning nerve, genic, genesis, neurogenic shock. So neurogenic, anaphylactic, and septic shock are subgroups of distributive shock because they have to do with the blood vessels widening and the pressure dropping. The fourth type of shock is a little less obvious. something is going down outside of the logistics offices. Oxygen is still coming into the heart is still pumping faithfully, the ships are coming into the harbour to collect the blood, there's enough ships, and the canals are ready and waiting for the ships to be routed on, but something is stopping the ships from leaving the harbour. And this could be a number of things. It could be a protest of dock workers and they're causing an obstruction. They're refusing to let things come out. It could be a ever-given drama where a particular ship has got stuck within a narrow canal and is backing up all the other ships behind it. Whatever it is, nothing's going out of the harbour. Nothing is leaving the logistics offices. What are some examples of this? A blood clot in the lung, a popped lung causing a kinking of the big blood vessel leading out of the heart, excessive amounts of bleeding in and around the area where the heart is trying to pump blood out of, causing pressure buildup in a local area. There's a lot of different causes for this, but the bottom line is we call it obstructive shock because there's an obstruction just outside of the heart. But I'm sure you're thinking that I've skipped one. What about the production plant itself? What about the factory? The lungs that are producing the oxygen? This is what we call hypoxia. Hypo, remember low, oxygen, oxia. Hypoxia is a source problem. And so we talk about it on its own terms. And what is a good example of this? Well, the one we're all familiar with, COVID-19. But let's get back to shock. Let's recap. We've got cardiogenic shock, where the heart is the problem. We've got hypovolemic shock, where the blood and the hemoglobin ships are the problem. We've got distributive shock, where the size of the blood vessels, the dilation of the blood vessels, results in a low pressure and poor forward movement problem. And remember, we can subcategorize that into septic shock, anaphylactic shock, and neurogenic shock. And of course, we've got obstructive shock, where a blockage outside of the heart is the problem. And that's it. So now you understand what the different types of shock are. The next step is to recognize it in a real life situation. And if you're keen to know a little bit more, watch my next video where we're going to dig a little bit deeper. For now, thanks for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.